Hello, my name's Olorotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be discussing the cabinet of our first president, George Washington. Now, I have in my past videos, I haven't really discussed George Washington, and it's kind of interesting because I think his was the first biography I ever read. I remember a book that was in my family library at home when I was growing up was the book Washington, the Indispensable Man, written by the Harvard historian James Thomas Flexner. And it was a very interesting book. Of course, a lot of George Washington's biography, they paint him, they project him as, in such of saintly manner, right? So they're normally hagiographies. Um, so maybe that's a reason why I've often not been interested in discussing him that much. But something that was clearly remarkable about George Washington was his abilities as a leader, right? Um, he wasn't a grandiose leader. He wasn't a megalomaniac like a Julius Caesar or or an Augustus or like many modern leaders that we know today. What was remarkable about George Washington was that he was not afraid to hire people that were smarter than him and stay in the background. Of course, he led them, he directed them, he set the tone, but he let these very capable, competent men run their departments. And of course, he had a very acrimonious first cabinet, which led to the development of our two political parties, our first two political parties, and subsequent political parties still today have sort of been molded after that original template. That was the division between the Federalist Party and the Anti-Federalist Party. The Federalist Party, of course, led by our first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who was also our first immigrant cabinet member. And of course, there was the camp of the Anti-Federalists. Or they're also called the Anti-Democrat. They're called the Democratic Republicans as well, or Anti-Administration Party, which was led by uh, our first. I'm going to make a correction. He was our first substantive Secretary of State, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, so that's, you know, just to show you the level of talent. Of course, he went on to be our third president. That's Thomas Jefferson. He was our second vice president. So there was a huge um, um, talent pool, right, in George Washington's first two administrations. Many people still describe it as the most talented cabinet we've ever had. Of course, today the cabinet members they've grown to 16. Back then, they were just four, right? In our first two administrations, they're just four cabinet members. Um, and by the way, that does not include the vice president. So our first vice president, of course, was elected. He was the second runner-up for the position of president, and he automatically became vice president, and that's John Adams. John Adams, of course, was a brilliant Harvard graduate who was a lawyer as well and a founding father. He described the vice president's position as the most insignificant office contrived by man, conceived by man, right? Um, he did not participate in the cabinet meetings. The first full cabinet meeting in George Washington's administration occurred in November 1791. The first person to be confirmed as a cabinet secretary was Alexander Hamilton. This was September 11, 1789. Of course, George Washington was sworn in as president on April the 30th, 1789, in New York City. He took the oath before Robert R. Livingston. It's interesting. The R stands for Robert. So it was Robert Livingston. Robert Livingston. The reason why he's Robert was because he comes from a great family of Livingstons who were judges, very accomplished people. So he was Robert R. Livingston. He was a member of the Committee of Five who drafted the Declaration of Independence, and he was a very good friend of our first um, Chief Justice John Jay. Both of them were graduates of Columbia University at the time. It was called King's College. Columbia University, that's my alma mater. I have a I have a degree from Columbia University as well. So uh, something I wanted to focus on today was that the fact that uh, George Washington hired people that were clearly smarter than him, right? He was a leader, he was able to lead men, he was not afraid to pick people smarter than him, and they deferred to him. In fact, George Washington is not known as even though we always call him a general, he was, the commanding general of, the Continental Army. He wasn't a brilliant military strategist, but he was a brilliant leader of men. He led a ragtag army. Without a doubt, the American forces would not have won the war against the British for independence without the help of the French, right? French military officers like Lafayette and other Europeans. In fact, many of these Europeans were, they had actually exaggerated, in fact, fabricated their credentials. But people wanted to, the European forces, allies who helped us, they wanted to see the they wanted to help diminish the power of England, right? And they wanted to because Britain had just defeated the French in the Seven Years' War and won the Ohio River Valley, right? And so it was the French, of course, were retaliating. They were getting their own back, and they supported George Washington and the ragtag army that we had. So George Washington wasn't a professional career professional military officer. He'd been part of several different, he'd been in part of militias, and he'd been a colonel in the British regiment. But he was really a planter, right? He was a planter, was a surveyor. George Washington also was not, he didn't have a degree like most people in his cabinet, office. In fact, in his cabinet, virtually everybody, the only other person who didn't have a degree or was not a professional was Secretary of War Henry Knox. Henry Knox was also another brilliant man. He was from Massachusetts. He was an autodidact. He was self-taught. And this was something George Washington was as well. So George Washington had been a surveyor, right? He'd been a surveyor, had been a planter. Until the 20th century, he was the richest president the richest person to serve as president of the United States. Of course, after his time in office, he became broke. So our early presidents became broke as a result of serving in office. They basically went bankrupt, insolvent. Many of them like James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson. Uh, they didn't have a pension at that time. So but importantly, as I was saying, he picked a very brilliant cabinet, and he was not afraid to pick men who might have been combative, like Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson. His main requirement was that they were brilliant and they were loyal to the American cause. So he didn't look for lackeys or an echo chamber like many men do, and he was not grandiose, right? Jefferson, I mean, they had tried to make him a king or give him these uh, grandiose, um, bombastic titles, and he chose Mr. President. Again, like I said, he was sworn in to office by Robert Livingston, who was a friend of John Jay. So let me get into the cabinet members. Since I mentioned John Jay was the first acting Secretary of State, right? He was the first acting Secretary of State. So the person that George Washington had in mind for Secretary of State was fellow Virginian Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as like a minister to France. He was overseas. And John Jay, in fact, he served as acting Secretary of State, basically as placeholder, holding the position until Thomas Jefferson came back. And he served, that's John Jay, held that position as acting Secretary of State, concurrently with being our first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So again, the cabinet was brilliant. They were highly qualified people. It's not like today that many presidents, might choose, lackeys who are yes men. That wasn't what our first cabinet was made of. John Jay, of course, as I said, he was our first Chief Justice, and prior to that, he had held the position of Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, right? So he was the first to hold that position, and it was abolished, and that title was changed to Secretary of State. So he was the first acting Secretary of State. He had been appointed Chief Justice, right? So he was serving concurrently as first Chief Justice of the United States, and he was a placeholder serving as acting Secretary of State until Thomas Jefferson came back from France, and Thomas Jefferson, became Secretary of State in March 1790. So you can actually have a glimpse, an idea of the role of the Chief Justice just from our first Chief Justice and another Chief Justice who'd served as Secretary of State, John Marshall. John Marshall, our longest serving Chief Justice. Today, I'm not going to be discussing Chief Justice buses, but I'm just giving you a glimpse, an idea of how the role of the Chief Justice of the United States is sort of like a diplomatic role, right? A diplomatic role, a politician, and you can see it's continued today because our first Chief Justice, he'd served as acting Secretary of State. He'd served in a position that was equivalent. It was our first diplomat by being Secretary or Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's John Jay. John Jay, by the way, had also served as a governor of New York. He had held many different roles, so he had been a politician. So you can see the role of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They're sort of like the diplomat, the politician. We've actually had a president who's been Chief Justice. That's William Howard Taft, right? He was President of the United States, and then he subsequently, after he lost, to Warren G. Harding, he subsequently was appointed. Sorry, he lost not to he lost to Woodrow Wilson, who became 28th president. He would be appointed by Warren G. Harding, the successor of um, Woodrow Wilson. And so William Howard Taft was appointed Chief Justice under Warren G. Harding. It's interesting that I mentioned that Taft, who'd been president and then went on to serve as Chief Justice. John Jay, our very first Chief Justice, had actually served as President of the Continental Congress, but we normally don't count the presidents of the Continental Congress as our president. So because we had Articles of Confederation, and so we got our independence from the British in 1776, right? We didn't have a United States as we have it organized, right? The organization of a strong national government didn't come until the Constitution of 1787, uh, which was advocated by Alexander Hamilton and John Madison. Sorry, James Madison. James Madison became our fourth president. So we normally count our first president as George Washington because the country was reconstituted with a strong national government under the Constitution of 1787, 1789, which was there was a ratification in 1791 with the Bill of Rights and things like that. So we were now reorganized under the Constitution of 1787, and that's when we started counting our first president after George Washington was sworn into office on April 30, 1789, by Robert Livingston, who was Chancellor of New York. So John Jay was president. He had a very, very impressive resume. He'd been president of the Continental Congress between 1778 and 1779. He'd been a governor of New York. He was a graduate of Columbia University. It was called King's College at the time. So he was acting Secretary of State. Now, our first Secretary of State, after John Jay. John Jay had been acting Secretary of State. He was a placeholder. So our first Secretary of State was, of course, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson became our third president. He became our second vice president. And Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador. He was a graduate of College of William and Mary. The College of William and Mary was the most prestigious um, college university in the South, right? In Virginia. Virginia was the richest state at that time, right? In our founding. Um, and so he was, of course, today, University of Virginia is normally viewed as the most prestigious university in the South. It's interesting that its founder was Thomas Jefferson, and University of Virginia is a public university. Thomas Jefferson, who came from the prestigious Randolph family, you can call it an aristocratic family in Virginia. He was a populist, right? He was a notorious supporter of the French Revolution, in which they were executing, beheading the uh, the French aristocrats, right? So he wanted education. He advocated for education to be open to the public, right? To the public, to the ordinary man, to ordinary Americans, because back then people who had college education came from wealthy homes or elite families. It wasn't affordable to everybody. But it's interesting that all of the cabinet members, except if they were a general like Henry Knox, right, or a physician like James McHenry, I'll talk about these people later on. Everybody had a university education, an elite university education. You'd see them Princeton, Yale, Harvard, right, College of William and Mary. Again, today maybe College of William and Mary is still an elite university. Uh, but it's interesting that the university that's considered the most prestigious in the South, that's University of Virginia, it was created by a graduate of College of William and Mary. That's Thomas Jefferson. Again, Thomas Jefferson believed that university education should be free to the public, right? Should be free and to the public, and the ordinary men should have access to quality university education. Um, by the way, Thomas Jefferson had the largest library in North America, right? One of the largest private libraries in the world. Of course, he would sell his books, about 6,700 volumes, 6,700 volumes, to the Library of Congress after the War of 1812 for about $25,000 or so, roughly. Um, so that was Secretary of State uh, uh, Thomas Jefferson. And after Thomas Jefferson, the next Secretary of State was a guy called Thomas Pickering. Thomas Pickering was a graduate of of Harvard, right? He was a graduate of Harvard. He was a lawyer. It's important. Virtually everybody in the George Washington's first two cabinets was a lawyer, right? Virtually everybody was a lawyer, and apart from people who were generals like Henry Knox. Henry Knox was um, so let me talk about Henry Knox. Henry Knox was our first Secretary of War. He was from Massachusetts. He was an autodidact, self taught man. He didn't have a college education, but he was a bookstore keeper, right? He worked as an apprentice in a bookstore and he loved reading. So he read about military history. So our first founding fathers were practical men, right? So he read about military history and things like that. Um, and when the war broke out, the War of Independence broke out around 1775, was about 25. He joined the militia, and he did very well and he rose because of his background being a storekeeper. He had a background in logistics and things like that, and he would rise to become a major general, right? So many of you see that Americans, we have that hands-on appreciation for hands-on experience, right? So he wasn't educated in a military school or anything like that, but he had hands-on experience from fighting and as a storekeeper. And he read military history himself. So he was self-taught. He became Major General. And he was our first Secretary of War. That's Henry Knox. He was from Massachusetts. And that's the thing about George Washington again. He didn't fill the first cabinet with lackeys from Virginia. He was from Virginia. In fact, the only person that was from Virginia, just two people, right? In his first two, in his three, in his two administrations, we have three people from Virginia. In his three administrations, that's Thomas Jefferson. Um, who else was from Virginia? Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph, by the way, was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson came from the Randolph family, right? Thomas Jefferson came from the Randolph family, and he was a graduate of College of William and Mary as well. And then there was another guy who succeeded Edmund Randolph. He subsequently became Attorney General himself. I'll talk about him. That's Charles Lee. Charles Lee was from Virginia as well. Charles Lee was a graduate of Princeton. Interestingly, he didn't go to College of William and Mary. He went to Princeton, just like James Madison. James Madison, our fourth president, didn't go to College of William and Mary. He went to Princeton in New Jersey, right? So, um, uh, so Henry Knox was Secretary of War. After Henry Knox, Thomas Pickering served as Secretary of War. Thomas Pickering was a graduate of Harvard. He was a lawyer. Thomas Pickering was from Massachusetts as well. So again, uh, George Washington didn't fill the cabinet up with lackeys from Virginia, right? Acolytes from Virginia. He had a balanced cabinet, and his main priority was to have the best and the brightest, right? Highly qualified people. So Thomas Pickering served as Secretary of War at some point. He served as Secretary of State at one point. And importantly, something I wanted to point out was that the um, Jefferson's cabinet, which was now splintering into two factions, the Hamilton camp, which was Federalists, versus the Anti-Federalists, who were led by the Jefferson camp, right? So the Hamilton camp had more loyalists, more acolytes, right? More people were loyal to Alexander Hamilton, and one of those was Thomas Pickering, right? Who was a lawyer as well, graduate of Harvard from Massachusetts. Even Charles Lee, later on, who would become Attorney General later on, was also graduate of Princeton. Although he was from Virginia, was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. But Charles Lee was a Federalist. He was a loyalist of Alexander Hamilton as well. Um, so, so these in the Secretary of State position, there was Thomas Pickering. So let me move over to the Secretary of Treasury. So of course, I've done videos about Alexander Hamilton, so I'm not going to dwell on him. Alexander Hamilton was a brilliant immigrant. He went to Columbia University. It was called King's College back then. He became a brilliant lawyer. He's the father of the American system. He designed our federal system. He's the main author of the Federalist Party that advocated for a strong national central government. And he also, a main dispute between him and Thomas Jefferson was the creation of a national bank. He wanted to create a national bank. And again, so he was a lawyer, he was many things. Of course, his great opportunity came when he was chief of staff or aide de camp to George Washington during the war, right? And he married into a very wealthy family, a wealthy New York family. So his life changed, and he was a founding father. Of course, he would die in the duel. So that's Alexander Hamilton. And the next Secretary of the Treasury was and Alexander Hamilton remains the youngest Secretary of the Treasury. He was about 32 years old, and he was unanimously confirmed by the Senate on September 11, 1789. He was the first cabinet member to be confirmed by the Senate. By the way, the first full cabinet, held their first meeting in November 1791. It consisted of course, the president, George Washington. Again, John Adams wasn't there. It consisted of George Washington and then four cabinet members, and they were Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury; Edmund Randolph, Attorney General; and Henry Knox, who was Secretary of War. Now the I, what's his name had a scandal, right? There was a scandal over what's called the first sex scandal when Alexander Hamilton was having an affair with a woman, a married woman, who was actually coming into his house and was having sex with her in his home, right? And he wrote a letter admitting to it. And of course, it damaged his reputation. And so he would resign later on. That's Alexander Hamilton. He would leave the position. But his acolyte, his follower, Oliver Walcott Jr., would take over as Secretary of Treasury. Oliver Walcott Jr. was a protege of Alexander Hamilton. He was a brilliant man, Yale graduate, graduated from Yale. He was a lawyer. He was judge in Connecticut. He had been a judge. Um, He'll become a judge later on, I think, in the federal circuit, actually. But he was from a very prominent, wealthy family in Connecticut. He was a Yale graduate. He'd done a variety of things. He was auditor of the U.S. Treasury. He was comptroller of the U.S. Treasury. He'd done a variety of things. That's Oliver Walcott Jr., again, a lawyer and Yale graduate. Um, in the Secretary of War, after Henry Knox left, again, Thomas Pickering held the position briefly, but there was somebody else again. The person who held the position as well for a long period, even into the Adams administration, was a guy called James McHenry. He was a physician and a surgeon, and importantly, he was the second immigrant, right? So you see, our first cabinet was made up of immigrants, apart from um, uh, Alexander Hamilton, who'd immigrated at 15 from the island of Nevis from the Caribbeans. There was also an Irish immigrant. He was a Scots Irish who was born in Ireland. He'd immigrated in his teens. That's James McHenry. He was a physician and a surgeon. Interestingly, he had trained to become a physician, a surgeon, under the great Benjamin Rush, a founding father. Benjamin Rush was a physician, brilliant physician. I think some people call him our first psychiatrist in America. But he was the one who reconciled his two friends, the frenemies, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. He reconciled them, and of course they started that great correspondence, presidential correspondence, after their presidencies in the twilight of their lives, right? So so that was James McHenry. James McHenry was a physician. So I guess our first physician to be a cabinet member. He was Secretary of War, right? He was a surgeon, and he was another acolyte. He was another follower of. He was a loyalist of Alexander Hamilton. So the cabinet of uh, George Washington was filled with Alexander Hamilton's loyalists. So you can see why the party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison was also called the anti-administration party, because the administration of George Washington and John Adams was filled with followers of uh, Alexander Hamilton, who led the Federalist Party, right? Um, Now, apart from the Secretary of War cabinet, sorry, the Secretary of War, there was also the Attorney General. So let me talk about the Attorney General. So the first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was from the again aristocratic Virginia aristocratic Randolph family from his mother's side. Um, I don't know, I've mentioned it before that John Marshall and fourth Chief Justice and longest Chief Justice John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson were actually cousins as well, but they hated each other. Um, so the famous Madison versus Marbury case we gave of us judicial review was both of them being sort of in combat, right, in conflict. So, but I digress. So, Edmund Randolph was a graduate of College of William and Mary, and he was a lawyer. He'd been Attorney General of Virginia at some point. He had been governor of Virginia. So these were men who were very competent, very had vast experience apart from elite education. Now, after him, there was a guy called William Bradford, right? William Bradford was from Pennsylvania. He'd been a justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He'd been Attorney General of Pennsylvania. William Bradford was a graduate of Princeton University. He was a graduate of Princeton University. And of course, then there was Charles Lee, who was from Virginia, but he was a graduate of Princeton University. He had been a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Um, he was a lawyer, like I said, graduate of Princeton, and he was a Federalist. He was another acolyte um, of uh, the Federalist Party, acolyte of Alexander Hamilton. Now, so that's our, the first cabinet made of very brilliant men. I talked of Thomas Pickering, who was a graduate of Harvard, and who was a lawyer as well. And he'd done a variety of things. He was from Massachusetts. He'd been a senator, so he did a variety of things. So these were very capable, very competent people in George Washington's first cabinet. I will probably try and do something and talk more in depth about this first cabinet that was made of brilliant men. And it's kind of interesting if they didn't have a university education like or college education like Henry Knox, who was a general, who was a major general and our first Secretary of War. But they were autodidacts like George Washington as well, right? They were autodidacts. They read a lot. They focused on self-improvement. It's Of course, now we're in a crisis. I've been seeing videos on social media, even articles saying that American high schoolers don't know how to read, that even college people entering university, including our Ivy Leagues, many cannot read a full book, right? And so we're in a crisis right now. It's interesting that our first cabinet members, were brilliant men. It was made of people who had elite education, and they were autodidacts as well. They're voracious readers, and they were learners, students. They continued to study. It was made up of an aristocracy of lawyers. I've been doing these videos. Hopefully, people will get an interest in reading. I love to read, but I'm going to stop this video here. I'll talk about cabinet members later on. My name is Olorotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.